Thank you for joining us. This is the third webinar series that we've done. Our first one was sort of an overview of really everything that we do as Bespoken. And then the last one that we did was on unit testing. I think that was about 2 months ago. And so now we want to talk about end-to-end testing. We've talked about this at a high level. I think some people have probably seen this in demo, a deep dive on that, especially with regard to some new features that we've added that we think are really neat. So what we're going to go over, we'll make some quick introductions. Wanted to give you an overview of what we do as Bespoken. Talk about testing and monitoring in general. So I did want to sort of frame overall what our offering is, and then go into end-to-end testing in depth, which is really the core of it. But then wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about continuous testing, which we also just refer to as monitoring, which is a new feature that we added that we're very excited about, and show that to you guys. And then also leave some time for questions at the end. And if you ask questions as we go through it, I'll try to check back in there, and then also I'm just looking at my phone just to see the questions there, so I don't have to change my screen all around. And so just for introductions, there's actually a number of people from Bespoken on this call, but I would just highlight I'm John Kelvey. I'm the CEO and founder of Bespoken. Bo Schroeder, who is our head of marketing, is here. And also Yvonne Perez, who leads our customer success. You'll see them online there, and you can chat with them. And then what do we do at Bespoken? We provide monitoring and testing tools for voice app. We're a recognized vendor of Amazon and Google. We have over 900 apps currently that we're monitoring, and over 2,000 developers that are using our software. And I would also just highlight that we have a long history with speech recognition and AI. I've been working with it for more than 5 years now, and really especially focused on testing it at scale from a usability perspective, from a performance perspective, and just accuracy as well. And so that experience that I have, we really we try to put that into our products, put it into how we approach solving problems and building great voice apps. And so testing and monitoring, overall, we just created this infographic that I think is kind of neat. It's meant to sort of summarize what we see as the overall can you guys see my screen? I just got a note saying that it's not being shared. Is that? Oh, okay, went on to screen sharing. Sorry about that. Let me turn that back on. Okay. All right. Now you guys can see my screen, right? I'll assume those, I hear the little noises from the bubble, so I assume that's a yes. Yeah, okay, it is. So sorry about that. So this infographic, we think it's pretty neat. It provides an overview around some of the high-level aspects of Alexa and voice apps. I think for a lot of folks on here, this is already known to you, but there's a lot of Alexa skills out there. There's a lot of people that are using smart speakers, over 47 million just in the US. There's hundreds of voice-enabled devices. You have just about every different form factor that's out there. And those are all things that make this space very exciting. And then things that are more specific to us, and we'll spend a little more time on these, but if you're thinking about what you're doing with testing, one thing to keep in mind is that the cost of catching a bug when it's in the design phase, it's 100th of what it is if it actually makes it out into production. And so, having good testing, having automation for your projects, which is something that we're really big on, it's a really helpful and important thing, because it really is going to save you a lot of money and a lot of time. In addition to that, there's some unique aspects to working with Alexa and with Google, with AI-based platforms in general, things that you need to keep in mind with them. And so that's sort of some high-level things to keep in mind. In terms of how we approach testing and monitoring, we sort of break it out into this layer cake here. And there's 4 layers. It's the manual testing, which is just around, doing things on sort of an ad hoc basis using a variety of different tools. Automated unit testing, which is about really ensuring that your code is working correctly. And it's sort of in isolation from the other pieces. End-to-end testing, which is testing the system as a whole. So it's about testing your skill, but it's also about testing the ecosystem that it works within. And then lastly, at the bottom there, we put the continuous testing. And this is after your skill has gone live, you do want to make sure that it is still working, and running regular tests on an interval to check on that. And so just a little more depth on each of these. The manual testing, this is really what's going to help you develop and debug faster. And there's a variety of different tools you can use for this. You can obviously use the devices themselves. You can also use virtual devices like the EchoSim or the Reverb app. I'm actually going to demo to you using the Reverb app. We like that a lot from our friends at Rain. And then you can use tools that don't require your voice to essentially create a text-based interface. And we have command line tools for this. And I would also just mention the new Ask console, testing consoles, is really helpful for that. And so manual testing is really an important part for building any skill. I think obviously anyone who is building one is going to do some of this, but it shouldn't be the end point. And it shouldn't even be necessarily the first thing that you do. Unit testing is really immensely helpful at every stage of the development process. And if you're starting to write some code and you're trying to figure out whether it's working correctly, you can do this about as easily as you can do, the manual testing that's out there. Our previous webinar was on unit testing. I'll put a link into this presentation on it if you want to go look at it. But we just spent time going through how you set these things up, how you set up code coverage for it, how you use some of our tools to effectively unit test, Alexa skills. It's really not very hard, and it really will save you a lot of time. So we encourage people to do that. And it works hand in hand with end-to-end testing, where unit testing, you're focused on testing your code, sort of in isolation, and you're not looking at all the other things that are part of deploying a voice app, which is really helpful. I mean, that may helps you quickly develop things, but then you do want to see that it's working as a whole. And in particular, there's considerations around the speech recognition and the NLU that you want to look at. And so to do that, we really recommend people that do end-to-end testing. And you're going to use automation to actually do the entire interaction. So you can interact with Alexa directly, have that talk to your skill. Your skill is going to talk to whatever other pieces it relies on. Could be DynamoDB, could be S3, could be REST API, whatever you might have out there, that's then going to return a response to the Alexa platform, which in turn is going to reply to a device. And so testing that whole round trip is really an important part. And it's important because, it's sort of obvious that you want to do complete tests, but there's specific considerations we would highlight for AI and for voice-based apps that we think are important to keep in mind. Systems are based on machine learning. They are constantly evolving. There are changes around how the speech recognition is working, how the NLU is working. And so it's not just something where, you build something, you test it, you put it out there to the world, and sort of a fixed artifact. Instead, you're working with a platform where it is actually changing over time. And so that change, you need to keep that in mind when you're thinking about your skill quality and ensuring that it is actually working. There's many different languages and locales. Obviously, internationalization of apps has been a concern for a long time, but I would say it's probably even more so today when you're thinking about a voice app, because obviously voice is then the point of interface, and it becomes essential that you understand the language that people speak in. It's meant to be an intuitive, natural thing. You don't, poor translations, things that don't make sense to people. That's maybe people have gotten away with that in apps, but if you're building a voice app, that really doesn't fly. So you need to make sure that you're building something that really does work great in whatever language people are using. And then lastly, platform behavior. So right now, I think, from what we can tell, most people are building for Amazon. There are a lot of folks building for Google as well. But then there's obviously Siri that's out there. Facebook is supposedly going to be entering this market. You have a lot of different players, and people want to deliver a consistent experience across those platforms. And so that's another sort of tricky consideration to keep in mind. And so how do we sort of approach addressing all those things? And with that, I want to jump in and actually show you some of our end-to-end testing capabilities and what we do with this. And let me try to zoom in here. So what I have here, this is a project actually that Yvonne put together. This is a skill that we sort of picked a little bit at random. It's sort of a just a list manager for your grocery list. But we liked it because it's in multiple different languages, and we did sort of want to highlight how we can work across different languages and localities. And this skill, actually, let me give you guys a quick demo of it. I'm just gonna pull up the Reverb app here on my phone. Open Bring.
Please first link your Bring account in the Alexa app.
No. I had already linked it. All right, well, somehow my account got unlinked, I guess changing around some of my configuration here. But the basic capabilities of the skill are you can add things to a shopping list. You can get it to list the things that are on your shopping list. And then you can remove items from it. So very easy to interact with, sort of a familiar pattern where you're dealing with a grocery list. And so when we're putting together tests for it, we have this really simple syntax for interacting with the skill. And what it is, you have on the left-hand side here, you can specify what you want to say to it. And then in this case, the right-hand side is simply the transcript of what it replies with. And keep in mind, to make this all work, we're actually going to take this text, we turn it into audio, we send it to Alexa. Alexa, in turn, interacts with the skill, and then the skill comes back with the reply. This is actually also an audio, which we then translate back into text. So this is a really simple test that we constructed here, but just so you know, there's a lot that goes on there, and it really is an end-to-end test. And so in this simple scenario, we're just saying, it's just sort of a one-shot invocation, and we get back a reply, and we make sure that it's correct. So very straightforward. Now, if we want to get into a slightly more complex example here, in this case, we're actually going to have more of a conversation with it. So we're going to open up the skill. We're going to see what the reply is. Then we're going to say, what is on my list? And there's a number of different things that we're going to check here. So one, we can specify for this transcript, not just a single value. So this list here, this means any of these values are correct. So right here, I'm saying this is what I'm expecting to say. But in this case, if I have multiple possible responses that are all valid, I can specify them as a list with this dash here. And that's really helpful. It's a very common thing, or it's a recommended thing, that you make your skills be conversational, that you make the voice apps be conversational by varying the responses so it feels more human, because we don't always respond in the exact same way to the same command. So you can actually test that part of it. You can also test the cards. So if the skill replies with a card, you can check the title, the subtitle, the text field, the image URL. The nomenclature here is from the AVS API, so it's a little bit different than what you're used to if you're typically using the ask JSON, but it basically corresponds to the same items. And I just heard, I think, a question there, so I'll just check that real quick. Oh, yeah, it is being recorded. So it's really straightforward putting together this test, and then to run it, we try to make this easy as well. So you can run an entire suite of tests or just run one in particular. So I'm going to go ahead and run this file. And it doesn't run real fast. It runs about as fast as if you were interacting with the device itself and talking to the skill. Now, we can't make the individual interactions go faster, but I will say, if you think, oh, well, how is this really going to scale? We do have the capability to have several interactions going on simultaneously. Hey guys, I hope you can hear me again. Sorry about that. I guess the video reinitialized there. I think I probably lost you around talking to the cards. We're talking about the cards. Okay. Hopefully not going to repeat myself too much, but just we set up this test with the cards. We did expect it would fail because the skill doesn't actually use a card. But you can see how that's constructed, and then you can also see here how a failure looks. And so it's highlighted in red and shows you the actual, which is null, meaning that there's no value, versus the expected, which is that there'd be an object there. And so to run another test, we can run our second one here. And just while that runs, I wanted to show you guys the documentation that we have on these pieces. So this scripting syntax that we have, it is based on YAML. YAML is meant to be a very simple, readable markup language. And in terms of the structure of it, all these different capabilities, like the list that I was mentioning, the testing of cards, they're described in here, as well as how you run it. An additional thing that I would highlight with this I see your question there. I'm going to answer that in a second. An additional thing that I would highlight with this is that we have this configuration element here. And so the configuration element, you specify the locale that you're using. In this case, we're using ENGB, which is for the UK. And then the voice ID, you can specify which poly voice to use. So in what we say to Alexa, we're using poly and we're using text-to-speech. And so for that, you can use any of these different elements that are out here. And this is particularly useful, obviously, as you get into different languages and different localities other than the US. But even in the US, it can be interesting to test your skill using a British accent or using an Indian accent. That can be a useful thing, and you can create scenarios around that very easily with this. And Neil, I saw that you asked, how is this different than the virtual Alexa, virtual Google Assistant pieces that we have? So it's probably confusing, I think, the way we set this up, but they are really quite different. The virtual Alexa piece is an emulator, which just means that that is actually going to go ahead. It's going to generate JSON as if it was Alexa, but it's not actually interacting with Alexa at all. It runs completely locally. It's just a JavaScript library, and it doesn't really require anything other than your skill code, and it just interacts directly with it. The end-to-end testing, which we refer to as virtual devices, that is completely different. That is completely different because that's going to require that you have your skill deployed. It's going to interact with it, in the, as a Lambda. It's going to be interacting via Alexa. So it's not emulating Alexa. It is actually using Alexa. So the interfaces, if you've looked at them, are quite similar, but because at the end of the day, you're basically saying, what's my utterance? And then what's the response coming back? But what's actually happening underneath the covers is just completely different. And we really recommend that people do both. I mean, they have very useful roles. Like I said, we did the previous webinar on unit testing, and we think that that's great. That's going to really help you with development. But this is really about ensuring the quality of the skill. It's a little more QA oriented. So you can set up these configs. You can set up lots of different tests. Our sort of best practice for this is to organize your tests by intent. So this particular skill has just 3 intents. And so we have files for each one of them. Not too complicated, but you can see that here's an interaction that goes 3 deep. And so you're saying open the skill, add cheese and wine to the list, read my list. And here's a good example of the variability. It'll say, okay, cheese and wine is on your list, anything else? Or, okay, cheese and wine is on your list, how would you like to proceed? So that's just a simple sort of friendly variation that was added. And you can test both those scenarios or ensure that both scenarios are valid with this sort of list feature here. I'll show you a little bit about how this is set up. So we create these virtual devices in our front end. I'm going to show you the front end in a moment. And essentially the virtual device is used per locality. So here we have 2 set up. One is going to be running against the UK. The other one is going to be running against Germany. These other flags are sort of more for us, but just the batch mode makes it run a little bit more accurately. That defaults to true. You can set different URLs here. But the key thing is actually setting up these devices, and you have those, you can think of those devices as corresponding to an actual physical device. And so that's what you're using to run these scripts. The German examples, let's just show you what these look like. It's not very different, obviously, in terms of the structure. We use a different voice. It is translated to German, but quite easy to work with. And actually, here's one thing I would just highlight is we do allow for wildcards within these scripts, so you can have a wildcard for the whole response or just part of it. And so if something's not being recognized correctly or something is highly variable, you just put this star in there and it'll allow the test to pass. And so with that, I actually want to show you the front end that we have here. And there's a couple things that I would highlight with this. One, where I was just talking about where you get this sort of device from. This is the token that goes there. So when you first sign up, it asks you to get a token. It associates it with the particular locality that your Alexa account is in. So it actually sets it up with your Alexa account. And once you have that, you can actually just cut and paste this and use that within those scripts. But what also is great about this UI is this is the new version of our user interface. And we have some of the same functionality here. We've actually had this for a little while. But besides the sort of testing functionality, and I'll show you how that works here. So I click Run Skill, and now it's going to start the interaction. And while that's running, I would just highlight, we have this monitoring button, and I've already enabled monitoring this, but you can enable or disable monitoring with just a click. And so the neat thing about that is you can set up a simple script here. This is very similar to what we were doing in the YAML format. It's a little bit less expressive, but you can do your basic interactions, and then you just click this button, and it's going to go ahead and it's going to run on a 30-minute interval this script against your skill, against the real Alexa. And that's really a great measure of how your skill is performing. That's going to give you a lot of insight into if there's any problems. And if for some reason it does have an issue, you're going to be notified via email. So it's a really neat feature. We capture a lot of the data here around what's happened. This one's not integrated, so you don't get all the information. But you have a lot of aggregate data there. And you can just have this running and really feel confident that your skill is working correctly, and know also that you're going to be notified if you do have any issues with it. So this is essentially repurposing the same technology, the same sort of scripting, so that you can do your testing both when you're doing your development, as well as after you've completed it and you've made your skill live and you really want to make sure that it's still working. A couple other things I would highlight here. So I have been interacting with the skill via my virtual device, and you can see it is associated with an Alexa account. Now I set up, this is a dummy Alexa account that I have. So this is set up in the UK, so we're testing there. And then I can go and look at this history. And so those interactions that I was running in the script, they're actually all here that I can see. And it's kind of interesting to listen to these. So I can go in here and I can click on one of these.
What is on my list?
And, oh, wait, actually. So one, you can hear what was said to Alexa, and then you can see what the reply was that was coming back from the skill. Now, you also get some of the same information if you just go to the home screen, but the difference is that that's really going to be where, in the case where it's recognized by the skill. You do run into cases where Alexa doesn't actually know what to do with the utterance, and so this history is really helpful because it tells you everything that Alexa thinks it's heard, whether or not it actually transmitted it to your skill. And so we can see all these interactions here, and this is really helpful, for debugging these tests. It's also just helpful if you use this and you get into using it a lot. You'll have various different accounts, you have various different virtual devices, and you can always go in here and say, gee, am I actually using the correct one that I think I am? You can see that those utterances are happening against your account. It's a very useful sanity check tool. And just before I go on to some of the programmatic pieces. So I'd see, Liz, you ask, I wonder if you could provide this simple example somewhere like GitHub. It would be great if I could start with a template unit test that works and then change things one at a time. That's an excellent point. So we do have a lot of projects on GitHub. And we have some samples there, but this project that we've created, I'll probably put this up on GitHub so that you guys can see it and have access to it. We think it's a really simple one for getting started that demonstrates the capability, and you can use this as the basis for constructing your own tests. That's very straightforward for us to do. I would also just keep in mind, we do have this documentation here as well that's available on the GitHub repo, which is also going to be, that's in our presentation. Um, and so also what we have in GitHub, so this whole API that I've shown you, or the whole, all these tests that I've shown you, these are all using tools that don't require any programming, which we think is something that's very useful. But we did mention that we were going to show you how this will work if you want to interact with it programmatically. And there's reasons why you might want to use the programmatic API. There's capabilities, if you have a lot of if statements or branches, or you want to get into some complex logic, this can be helpful. And so if you want to use that, it's very simple to set up. The interface, it's using JavaScript code, but at the end of the day, you're basically just sending utterances again. And then you're looking at transcripts and data that comes back from AVS. And so this is one that we set up for a skill that we had developed. It's a simple interaction. But it runs through, it tests everything. And if you wanted to write some more complex code around this, I mean, let's say that you had a huge list of slots that you wanted to test in a file. This is one thing we're looking at doing. You could write some simple code that loads up that file with all the slot values and then just sends them to a skill one after another. So that would be an example of something that you can do running this programmatically that you could not do if you're just running it, using the test script there. And then I'll also just mention with regard to the locales and languages, I mentioned that we do support other languages. Right now it's German and English. We expect to have French and Japanese very shortly. We're just in the process of actually testing those and ensuring that they are working right. And we work in all the localities that support English and German right now. So there's, you have Canada, obviously India, Australia, all of those are different localities supporting English. And in setting up your test for those scenarios, you can really, if you have a lot of localities that you want to test within, you want to make sure your skill is working right, you're not at all limited, by the tool, because you can set up many different virtual devices and have those running for each of those different areas. And it'll run quite quickly through all those different scenarios, and two, you can have sort of an isolated environment for each of those skills. So, if you've been doing the testing currently, if you've been doing it manually with devices and configuring them and reconfiguring them, you don't have to do that. You can have just a dedicated virtual device set up for each of those locales, which is a really neat time-saving thing as well. So before I go into any more depth on this, just questions, any things that need clarification on what I've gone through so far? Make sure I am, still sharing. Let's see. Yeah, so I'll put this slide up if there are further questions. It is really easy to get started with this, just to show you guys what's involved. Setting this up, you're just going to do npm install Virtual Device SDK SG. And with that, you're up and running. And you can start setting up your own test scripts and running them through yourself. All right, I see. So Matthew asks, is end-to-end testing a good tool for testing triggering an intent upon invocation? What about invocationless usage? I'm not sure what you mean by invocationless usage. I guess, I mean, whether you're testing, we certainly do support testing things. Okay, right. Using it for testing app discovery, I can't really speak to that. I'm not even quite sure what the state of the art is with regard to app discovery. But yeah, you probably could use it for that. It is, at the end of the day, you are talking to Alexa, so that should work, but I would need to try that out further. Like I said, I'm not even sure what the state of the art is there, but definitely you can skip directly to an intent with this, or you can start with doing a launch request. Other questions? I'll just go back to our screen here. And just fix this slide. How accurate is the ASR? It's pretty accurate. I would guess, I would say let's say it's around 90 to 95% accurate. And there's enhancements that we've made recently that we think will increase that even further. It's not going to be 100% accurate. I can tell you there's definitely scenarios as we're going through and we're creating these scripts where it just doesn't seem to get things right or get them right in a reliable way. And in those cases, we do make use of the wildcard, the asterisk that we showed there. If you have a skill that's returning names or words that are easily confused, some of those can be trouble spots. All right, well, I'm going to stay on here for a few more minutes. I do thank everyone for joining. And if you do have more questions, please just ask. We're happy to answer them. You can also see our contact information in the presentation and reach out to us afterwards that way.